The White House has blamed Iran for assisting Russia in targeting civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. It's alleged that Iranian military personnel have been assisting with drone strikes in Crimea. We're now joined by Professor Abel Esterhuise from the University of Stellenbosch. Prof. Esterhuise, thank you very much for availing yourself this afternoon. We are being made to understand that Vladimir Putin is flirting with the idea of unleashing nuclear weapons and there possibly being a nuclear war. Maybe a brief history lesson in terms of when last we saw something like this and whether this is anywhere near the scale of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Well, I returned from Europe about a week ago, and I have no doubt in my mind that in the European context, they see what is unfolding at present as on the same level, if not more dangerous than the Cuban Missile Crisis. And there's four critical reasons, I think, that we need, or critical variables that we need to consider here. The first one is an understanding that nuclear weapons, their purpose is deterrence. Their purpose is not in their use. The utility of nuclear weapons is in their possession. That's the first point I think one has to raise. The second point I think one has to put on the table is the fact that, in my opinion, there's at the moment very high-level discussions going on about nuclear weapons, and that there's very high-level talks with the Russian government and Mr. Putin himself, I think. And my takeaway from what I understood in the European environment is that as long as there's no Ukraine feet on Russian territory, there's actually no justification for Russia to use nuclear weapons. And then, of course, one has to bring and factor in the harsh reality that increasingly the rationality of decision making within the Russian context is under question, and there's questions being raised by people in the West in particular about the rationality of decision making. And perhaps a last point about the nuclear option, one has to remember that the nuclear option is the last option, and it is for Russia the last option, because if they utilize and employ nuclear weapons, even if they use tactical nuclear weapons, it will probably be the end game for Mr. Putin and Russia as we know it. So it's really the last option for Russia, I think.
A last option, no justification to use nuclear weapons by Russia. You also mentioned it's a deterrence. To deter whom? To deter what?
Well, that's the debate, and there's no doubt that the big problem for Mr. Putin, the strategic problem for Mr. Putin at the moment, is Western involvement and support for the war in Ukraine. This is a proxy war for the West, and I have no doubt in my mind that the West, and NATO in particular, is doing the operational planning for this war for the Ukrainians. The West is supplying the Ukraine forces with equipment. They're training the Ukraine forces. So there's no doubt in my mind that this is a typical proxy war for the West. This is the kind of thing that the former Soviet Union did in places like Korea and Vietnam many years ago. If we talk about deterrence, I think in the mind of Mr. Putin and Russia, the West is probably the most prominent entity to be deterred.
What does a nuclear weapon do? So maybe help us visualize it, right? So there's this talk of nuclear weapons. If one is set off, what exactly happens?
Well, the danger, of course, of a nuclear weapon is not only the huge destructive power, and I mean, the nuclear weapon has a huge destructive power, but the problem with nuclear weapons also is the nuclear fallout. In other words, once you've used nuclear weapons, the nuclear fallout will be in that area for many years to come. And I mean, we have seen the Chernobyl accident in '86, and that area is still a no-go area for humans. So the danger of nuclear weapons, not only their huge destructive capacity, and it is, I mean, we're talking about tremendous destruction capacity, but also the nuclear fallout. That's the actual danger of nuclear weapons.
I do wonder whether you've maybe had time to formulate an opinion on this, but with everything that is happening in the United Kingdom, if you listen to their media, they're very worried about how they are seen on the world stage, and much of it, some have hinted to their position in terms of the Russia-Ukraine war. Does it make their voice watered down because of what's happening politically there?
Well, of course, domestic politics always influences what goes on the international stage. But Britain is just one of the voices within NATO and within the European Union at the moment. And I don't think the domestic political instability in Britain will have any decisive influence on how NATO and European are to conduct their operation and their involvement in the war in Ukraine. I doubt that very much. I think the key role players here very much or they are Germany and the United States, with perhaps Britain as a third important. But yeah, I doubt whether the domestic political realities in Britain will in any way affect what is going on in the Ukraine.
Sure. Prof, before I let you go, you mentioned that this is a proxy war for the United States. With what end in mind?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think, there's no doubt on the Russian side that they want to see the Ukraine as an integral part of the Russian sphere of influence, to some extent a puppet government, and Russia having control over that. And of course, that is unacceptable for Europe in many ways. So how it's going to play out, we don't know. I think this war is still to last a long time. But one also needs to keep in mind that Russia is the aggressor here, and the war may be over tomorrow if Russia withdraws from Ukraine.
Professor Abel Esterhuise from the University of Stellenbosch. Thank you, Prof.